So I'm going to tell you today why I'm anxious about the brain, and on the other hand, how the brain leads to anxiety and other such disorders. So the brain is probably the most complex organ in the universe, and we're still far away from understanding it, but I'm going to give you some of the progress we recently made. The brain, on one hand, generates the most beautiful behaviors that we, as humans and other animals, produce on a daily basis, and it also allows us to cope with a flexible, adaptive environment that changes every day. On the other hand, the brain also produces, in many individuals, debilitating conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, autism, anxiety, and so forth. These conditions are actually on the rise in recent years, both in the US and in Europe. There's an enormous number of individuals, and it puts a huge toll on individuals and society. I'm going to try and explain and give some analog to how it comes about in the brain. So the brain, I'm going to use the analog of a neighborhood. The brain is composed of two things, just like a computer, the hardware and the software. The hardware you can think of in a neighborhood, we see here Boston, is the roads, the houses, and everything that allows daily life. The software are actually the people and the communication between them. And this is very similar to neurons in the brain. So in human life, we can think about how we interact with one or two people. We all know how to have a reasonable conversation with one person. We talk, we listen, that makes sense. But can you talk to more people simultaneously? Well, all of us can have a conversation of 4 people, that's still reasonable, maybe 6. Our kids maybe can do more, they're multitasking these days. Can you actually talk and communicate with 50, 60, 100 people continuously and at the same time? Obviously, no, that's too hard. But that is exactly what's going on in the brain. And even more than this, we mentioned a few dozens of people. In the brain, each cell, each nerve cell, communicates with 10,000 other nerve cells at a similar, in real time. This is obviously an enormous dimension. Imagine you're sitting here, 10,000 other people are whispering something in your ears, and you have to respond, and 10,000 other people are listening to you. Obviously impossible, but that is actually how neurons in the brain communicate. So how many neurons are there in the brain? Well, there's a huge number, and number is approximately 80 billion in a human adult. That is like, imagine as the analog, that people, the population of 10 Earths will be simultaneously talking to one another. So there are 2 levels of complexity here. One is the number of nerve cells, 80 billion, and the other is that each individual nerve cell communicates with 10,000 other nerve cells simultaneously at the same time and at the resolution of 1 millisecond, 1/1000 of a second. That is an amazing amount of parallel information going on. So this high complexity, while on one hand, it also allows the beautiful, amazing behavior, learning, memory, etc., social interaction, is also very problematic because it leads to vulnerability, high vulnerability. Just like any too complex system, it is also very fragile. Since the brain is so complex, it's even more fragile. So imagine, just as an example, that in one part of the brain, you have some abnormal activity in the network. This can spread to another place in the brain via many, almost an infinite number of routes it can go from. Maybe today a current analog would be social networks, where fake news starts somewhere, spreads, and then goes to another place in the world and spreads even more. And it's really almost impossible to identify what exactly is the source of the maladaptive, abnormal activity and what it induces later on. And so this one makes the brain on one hand so complex, but on the other, so vulnerable to abnormal activities that can spread and induce depression, autism, anxiety, etc. So let's dive into the brain and see what are actually the brain regions that are involved. And there are two complementary yet competing mechanisms. One of them is the prefrontal cortex, this nice area over here that we know has evolved in primates and in humans. And this region is responsible for the rationality we have, for the complex adaptive behavior, daily learning from rewards and errors. Basically, it makes us smart as we are. The other hand is the amygdala, which is also very smart, but it's smart on a different scale. It's smart on an evolutionary scale. It underlies emotions and survival mechanisms that have led us to, and animals, to survive so well along evolution. And so we have two scales of learning. One is a daily learning, complex learning. The other is emotional learning and modulation of emotions for survival benefits. And these two regions are communicate with one another on a millisecond resolution and balance one another to balance emotion on one hand and rational decisions on the other, and they do so simultaneously. And when this delicate balance breaks, this is where neuropsychiatric conditions actually emerge, and they can range, as I gave you example, depression, anxiety, autism, etc. So I'll give you one straightforward example. Imagine someone, let's call him Joe, who lives in Boston in that case, and next to his office there's a very busy road. Now Joe has either experienced a minor accident or observed a minor accident, and now has to cross the road on a daily basis to get to his favorite restaurant or something like this. Obviously, he should be anxious because this is a major road and he should be extremely, extremely careful. That's evolution, right? That's what evolution made us do. Be extremely careful about dangerous things. And so he's over-anxious here. And let's see the mechanism that lead to this over-anxiety, justified anxiety. And they are exactly the mechanism I previously described. The complementary roles between the prefrontal cortex, the green upper one, and the amygdala, the lower blue region. And they constantly communicate. And when there's an emotional memory of something that is risky for survival, the amygdala is hyperactive, and the prefrontal cortex is a little bit hyperactive, and you can see more neural activity coming from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex, causing Joe to exhibit anxiety and be over careful. And when the amygdala takes over too much, this over carefulness can lead from normal adaptive anxiety to actual anxiety disorders. Now I'm going to walk you through another model which we developed and used highly in the lab, and that's the model of generalization. So imagine John, as said earlier, saw an accident back there. He goes back home. He now he lives in a very calm neighborhood, and there's a road next to his beautiful home. Almost no cars there. It's a rural area, no problem. But still, every time John wants to cross the road, he goes into anxiety behavior. And that, on one hand, is abnormal, but on the other hand, it makes sense because John generalizes from the road in the office to the road here, which is what you'd expect from evolution, right? If I heard a lion, if I'm a zebra and heard a lion somewhere else, and I now hear something that is closely sounds like a lion, I should be careful and not take the risk. But in this case, it's obvious that this is somewhat maladaptive and abnormal, and John should not be over-anxious. And we call this model overgeneralization because unlike normal generalization, which is the foundation of all our learning and behavior, here there's overgeneralization to something which should not be the case. This is a similar environment, but not similar enough. And this actually underlies a lot of the post-trauma and anxiety and even depression, because the traumatic event, the anxiety, is exhibited in contexts and neighborhoods that are not very similar to the original terrible situation in which the trauma occurred. So how does this occur in the brain? Well, to do this, we need to understand how does the amygdala and prefrontal cortex interact at a more specific, detailed level. So the mechanism is basically the same mechanism that we saw next to the office. We see now here, there's an overactive amygdala and not an hyperactive PFC, although it's in a wrong implementation, in a overgeneralization, different context. And we want to revert that and have the PFC now take control and learn that this is now a safe environment and actually inhibit or down-regulate the amygdala. To do this, we need to understand something very important, and that's what we're working on. And this is how exactly a memory is coded in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And that relates directly to the amazing hard complexity I described earlier, and that's why it's a hard task. We have here an example of 5 neurons, and what you see are kind of like computer bits, 0 and 1s running, because that's what the brain, each neuron does, generates a sequence of information via bits, and we need to read out this activity and make sure that when we identify a specific memory that relates to the anxiety, depressive, or traumatic memory, as you can see on the left, there's a specific pattern which is much more complex than shown here because it lives in the high dimensional of 10,000 connections I spoke about earlier, but this is just an example. We need to take this memory and down-modulate it and make it into a more relaxed or normal or adaptive memory. I don't want to say we want to make it as joyous as we see on the right side. That might be too much. That may be a drink-related memory, but I think you understand the concept. And so to do this, we apply wide techniques, and those have to span everything I told you today. They start from behavior, models for anxiety, as I said, mentioned the overgeneralization. We have to work at the brain and look at all the brain almost at the same time, read out activity in the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and there's some other regions I did not mention today, read out the exact specific patterns of neural activity that goes on between these regions, use computational and theoretical methods to read out and decode and understand how memories are represented in this high-dimensional space. And then we can modulate by different novel techniques, modulate this activity and restore normal balance between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And once we restore normal activity, behavior will also be restored into adaptive behavior and normal responses. And hopefully we can ameliorate and even overcome depression, anxiety, post-trauma. We're now even looking at autism in this sense, and so forth. And so that's basically what we do in the lab, work in all these domains. And I hope that you're no longer anxious about the brain, but if you are, we are still working on it. Thank you very much.